Hello everyone and welcome into another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host as always, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for coming into today's show this lovely Wednesday afternoon. And for the show, we have another good one ahead, continuously recapping all of those wildcard games from the weekend. Starting out with the Steelers and Ravens and looking at the Chargers and Texans, two games that I can't necessarily promise I've known much about, considering the fact that there were so many, and I was more invested in the Sunday games than these ones, but still interesting games to discuss either way. Then I'll be talking a little bit about men's college basketball. If you're a college basketball fan, this segment is for you. Talking about all the big contenders and where they rank in terms of this midpoint in the season and how they could look headed into March Madness. Then I'll be previewing another big game in the Western Conference in the NBA between the Rockets and the Nuggets taking place tonight. And then, in terms of a change of plan to conclude today's show, we are going to be previewing a game that involves Arsenal, but not the North London Derby, because I kind of messed up my scheduling, but it's still going to be an interesting clash in the Premier League on Saturday between Arsenal and another side in top form. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show if you haven't done so already, to continue keeping up to date with all of our new content as it gets released. But if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, as always, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way, as always, to get your opinions out there on here. We love hearing your input. It just makes the show that much better, and it is genuinely appreciated by all concerned at the network. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment of the day, talking about that Steelers-Ravens game in terms of wild card weekend. A truly dominant performance by Baltimore that showed why they are legit Super Bowl contenders. Most importantly, a very layered performance, both offensively and defensively from them as well. As for the Steelers, another disappointing first-round exit in the postseason. And now a lot of fans are really shouldering, not necessarily fans, now fans are really pointing the finger, rather, at Mike Tomlin and his insistence in this kind of playoff stagnation. There hasn't really been much ambition outside of this organization the past couple of years to go on and make changes necessary to actually break through in the postseason. For example, yes, they went out and got Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, but are they the true answers to lead Pittsburgh into a new era? Should Mike Tomlin eventually get fired sometime soon? But this game clearly was not necessarily the best wildcard game, but it did prove to me that Baltimore has what it takes in the gauntlet that is the AFC. So without further ado, let's talk a little bit about, stats-wise, the big players in this game and the reason why they're going to continue, in the case of the Baltimore Ravens, to dominate the competition in terms of the AFC playoff picture. Lamar Jackson, let's start with him. For many, the presumed third-time MVP award winner. It still hasn't been decided yet, and he's going to be playing his MVP rival this weekend in the divisional round as they take on the Bills going up to Buffalo. But Lamar, consistent as always, 16 for 21, 175 yards, 2 touchdowns, and let's not forget what he does on the ground as well. A truly all-around QB. But the reason why his performance, in a way, can go a little bit more understated and still not mean that Baltimore is giving up much is because of Derrick Henry. 26 carries, 186 yards, and 2 touchdowns as well. Really showing that Baltimore has a new dimension to it and a really multifaceted one at that. Because if Lamar is as comfortable slinging the ball downfield as he has become, then Derrick Henry is going to be the end-all, be-all finishing factor in a lot of these games coming up for Baltimore, should they make it to the AFC Championship game. And really, just thinking about Derrick Henry's place, not just in this team, but in playoff history, he's quickly becoming one of the best running backs in postseason history. Obviously, there's a case to be made that Terrell Owens is even better because he has the Super Bowl, and he meant a lot to those Denver Broncos teams. But ultimately, looking at Derrick Henry is slowly making a case as being one of the best all-around postseason running backs, well, with his tenure in Tennessee and now what he's being able to do with Baltimore. And that just makes them a team that not a lot of teams want to go up against. And I know that it's going to be very tough. First off, going up to Buffalo to take on the Bills, and a guy in Josh Allen who's been fighting week after week to beat out Lamar for that MVP trophy and really hungry to prove why he's the better quarterback. And another offense that's just very multifaceted and very talented. It's going to be a fantastic game, but I feel like Lamar really is going to have to win that to really truly prove that he is more important to his team, more valuable to his team, and at this point, the superior player to Josh Allen. And then, after that, you're going to have to go down to Kansas City, to Arrowhead Stadium, to take on Patrick Mahomes, a guy who's already beaten you time in, time out, come the postseason. And so, it's a daunting task for Baltimore to undertake, but this is a good springboard. They've gotten over the Steelers, the divisional thorn in their side, and now they just have to worry about beating the two teams they're going to have to beat year after year in the postseason. And so, while this game certainly feels like a benchmark achievement for Baltimore proving their candidacy as a Super Bowl contender, you still have to play the two teams that you are going to have to face at these junctures time in, time out. And so, that's what I'm thinking about when I think about Baltimore. They've proven that their multifaceted offense and their much improved defense can really complement each other well and thus make it very hard for opposing teams. But these are the Bills and the Chiefs. These are two teams who can go toe-to-toe with you in any given time. So that's what I'm going to monitor when thinking about the Ravens from here on out in the postseason, no matter the year. Because it feels like it's going to be the same three teams for as long as these quarterbacks are with them. But on the Steelers side of things, let's talk a bit about where this puts them. Because it's an interesting quandary. Mike Tomlin, legendary head coach, hasn't had a losing season his entire tenure as the Pittsburgh Steelers head coach. However, these past 6 years, he has failed to win a playoff game. And in those 6 years, he hasn't really addressed the big positions you really need to address in order to win in the NFL, and especially the AFC, and especially the AFC North, where teams like the Ravens and Bengals are really making the come up. So, when you look at it, you can really start to say, well, it could be justified if the Steelers fire Mike Tomlin. But then again, it puts them in a very precarious position because I do think the Pittsburgh Steelers are a desirable destination for a head coach because their defense is still going to be one of the best in the league. They still have some nice weapons to build around offensively. I like George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth, but the question is, can they get the one position they've gotten wrong over these past 6 years right? And that's the quarterback position, because in the past 6 years, they've cycled between a semi-injured Ben Roethlisberger in the last years of his career, then kind of hovered around with Mason Rudolph, Duck Hodges, players of that nature, and somehow, some way, got into the playoffs, the failed experiment with Kenny Pickett, and still have not necessarily addressed it promptly enough to say that they're willing to contend in the AFC and the AFC North. Now, I do think that perhaps Justin Fields could be the answer in Pittsburgh. He played 6 games in Tomlin's system, and he looked good enough and competent enough at that to lead this team. But I do think that this team needs a young, competent signal caller they're confident in. Maybe they can find one in free agency, but the cycle cannot keep on happening to the point where year in, year out, we always view the Steelers as a team good enough to make the dance, but not good enough to break through and compete for a Super Bowl. So that's where I'm standing with the Steelers right now, because I do believe it will be justified if Mike Tomlin is fired. But the new head coach is going to have to be certain in his decision making from the get-go, because you have the platform, you have the infrastructure of a team built to contend, but you got to get that QB position right. And whether or not it's in-house decision or you're looking elsewhere in terms of free agency or potentially in this year's draft or next year's for that matter, you have to be sure that whoever leads your team is not going to be one of those cycled quarterbacks over the past 6 years, because you're going to be in playoff purgatory for most of them if you don't get this decision right. But other than that, congratulations to the Baltimore Ravens for proving that this multifaceted attack between Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry is going to be difficult to beat. And for Pittsburgh, it's going to be another rough offseason in a year that spells what could have been. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments below, because this was one of the more intriguing ones due to the fact that it's a divisional rivalry, but ultimately one of the more quote-unquote boring ones to talk about. When we come back after this short break, we're going to be talking about Chargers-Texans, most unexpected result, in my opinion, of the wild card weekend. We'll be right back to talk a little bit more about why after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you as always that if you wish to contribute and interact a little bit more directly throughout the duration of the show, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. Great way as always to get your opinions and input out there. I love hearing all your input and guidance for the show. I genuinely appreciate all of it, and I know a lot of the guys here at the network appreciate it as well. It just makes our shows that much better, and it's a great way, as always, to be a supporter of our networks and podcasts. But without further ado, let us jump right into our second segment, our second analysis of a wild card game this weekend. Perhaps the most unexpected result out of all the wild card games this past weekend. The Chargers and the Texans. A lot of people believing that the Chargers, as the road favorite, would absolutely annihilate this Houston Texans team, who has looked far from what they looked like last year, when C.J. Stroud was having a phenomenal rookie season and D'Amico Ryans, as a first-year head coach, really proved that his identity and culture was immediately taking root. And they ultimately proved us wrong with that D'Amico Ryans aggressive defense that we know and love and really turn this game on its head to where they were blowing out this Chargers team. And in terms of the Chargers and the impact this will have on this team, I don't necessarily think it's as big an impact as other playoff teams, considering the fact that the Chargers were one of those teams that no one really knew a lot about coming into this season. Yes, they went out and hired Jim Harbaugh. Yes, they got both J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards from the Ravens. But we really didn't know how it all fit together. Most importantly, we didn't know if Justin Herbert, who up to this point had been one of the best young gunslinging quarterbacks in the league, would fit into the system, would really coalesce in this system. And he did, and in this playoff game, for some reason, it all came crashing down to the point where he threw 4 interceptions and really looked listless in this one against the Texans defense that looked motivated, that looked hungry, and looked like it was primed for another upset against the Chiefs in Arrowhead. But let's talk a little bit about this game stats-wise and how these two teams, in the case of the Texans going on to face the Chiefs, and for the Chargers going into the offseason, will view this result. Let's start with the Chargers, and let's start with Justin Herbert's performance, because it was very lackluster, and I do believe that we're starting to see a pattern of repetition in terms of Justin Herbert performances in the postseason, even though we've only had 2 of them. 14 for 32, 242 yards, 1 touchdown, 4 interceptions. This game now sees his really paltry, lackluster QBR in the postseason only skyrocket by 20 points to just above 60. That's a horrific QBR for a quarterback who everyone believes is one of the best young quarterbacks in the league. And I know that it's something to do with Jim Harbaugh's system and how he fits in it, being asked to pass a little bit less than he was used to potentially in the Brandon Staley era. But there is something to be said about Justin Herbert entering the postseason in a game in which everyone is expecting you to win and perform well and screwing the pooch. And I think that Justin Herbert is still a talented quarterback who's going to get a myriad number of chances in future years to prove himself in the postseason. But this game really fell flat for him. And yes, I feel like one big issue that the Chargers do have to address in the postseason is getting him a little bit more help. But if you look at this team, they already look and have the feel of a playoff team. Their defense played well all year, one of the best scoring defenses in the league. Their O-line has 2 young bookend tackles who I really like, in Slater and Joe Alt. Ladd McConkey proved that he's a number 1 receiver. And yes, I know that a lot of people don't necessarily like Quentin Johnston and Joshua Palmer as secondary options, but they still think they're talented receivers. It's more about the intentionality of the Chargers decisions rather than, I feel, in-house mistakes they've already made. Because I do think they're building something and they deserve to get into the postseason this year. But the reason why I think there's a separation between them and the AFC's elite is that with this transition, it spells different ways to go about decision making. Whereas Brandon Staley had a formula in terms of what decisions he wanted to make, Jim Harbaugh will have his. And they may be completely different from what everyone is thinking about for the Chargers this offseason, pundits and podcasters like myself alike. So I don't really know how the Chargers are going to approach this offseason, but all I know is that I do feel that improvement is going to be imminent, and I do think that the Chargers are in an advantageous position in the draft to pick someone, whether it be on the offensive side of the football or the defensive side of the football, that will fill an area of need for them. But looking at the paltry performances of every receiver outside of Ladd McConkey, who had 197 yards and 1 touchdown, it is telling that you haven't built that infrastructure to support Justin Herbert, even in a very run-heavy offense already. And that's what I think separated these two teams. Let's talk about Houston, because On offense, I still think there's a lot that needs to be ironed out. CJ Stroud looked a bit better, but not much better. 22 for 33, 282 yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Made a couple incredible plays, but ultimately still looked a little bit rusty. Not like the CJ Stroud of old in last year's postseason where he was slinging the ball all over the field against Cleveland. But the story of the day belonged to the Texans' defense. Eric Murray, D'Angelo Ross had 2 interception returns for touchdowns. And I really think that this was a comprehensive performance in all 3 phases for this Texans defense. Danielle Hunter and Will Anderson Jr. were getting pressure up front. These young bucks in the secondary, the guys who I really like, Stingley, Lassiter, really held up well, really played remarkable football, and ultimately led me to believe this Texans defense is what is going to be the X factor in their divisional round game against the Chiefs, and if they pull out the upset, the championship round against the Bills or Ravens. And so that's why I think a lot of people were so enamored by the Chargers, but ultimately underestimated the Texans defense. They thought that this Chargers team was coming in hot on both sides of the football, and the Houston Texans at that point didn't win convincingly. CJ Stroud looked rusty all season long. The offensive line had issues. And while everyone knew this Texans defense was good, they really thought that it wouldn't matter because Justin Herbert was going to come out there and have himself a day. But no, the defense stamped its mark. The offense was solid enough. And the Texans are moving on. And the Chargers aren't. But ultimately, I do believe that as a whole, we collectively have underestimated this Houston Texans team. Because who's to say that CJ Stroud can step up? Who's to say that this defense can't pull off another great performance against a much tougher opponent in Patrick Mahomes and his Kansas City Chiefs? Who's to say that this win isn't a springboard for bigger things to come? I think that this win, especially considering their performance all season, was a turnaround for them. And I do feel that this divisional round game coming up against the Chiefs is going to be much more highly competitive than we all imagine. And I think that when it comes down to the questions that will still be surrounding the Texans in that game, will CJ Stroud play better? Will this offensive line be able to handle everything that Steve Spagnuolo and his defense are going to throw at them? Will this defense play another great game? I don't necessarily think it matters because they've already proven people wrong. And no matter how people view this season for the Texans, as a team where everyone was thinking after their very successful year last year, in both CJ Stroud and D'Amico Ryan's first year, they were going to build much bigger and aim for even higher heights than we thought. Potential Super Bowl contenders, easy AFC South winners in that very easy conference. It doesn't matter to me because from where they are now to what we'll think of them after the season is an entirely moot point because of this game, in my opinion. This game gave them life. And before this game even happened, we were talking about this team as a lifeless entity. We thought they had no chance. We thought that this Chargers team under Jim Harbaugh was a sneaky dark horse contender to not just beat this Houston team, but go toe-to-toe with their AFC West rivals. And we were already planning for that game. I think a lot of people were thinking this Chargers-Chiefs game, round 2, is going to be incredible. But this Texans defense and this Texans offense is more than the sum of its parts. Yes, there are going to be questions, but they've already answered several of them already. And so, in terms of my final analysis of this game, it was truly bizarre considering the fact that I thought that myself, the Chargers were going to win. And then they ultimately didn't show up. But now I'm starting to think that this Houston Texans season is now going to be viewed as a lot more successful to a lot of people than what would have happened had they lost. Because no matter what takes place at the Chiefs and Arrowhead on Saturday, or is it Sunday? I'm not sure. I've got to check the schedule. But no matter what takes place, I still think this team achieved something that not a lot of people thought they would. And that might just be a little bit better than over-exceeding people's expectations. But ultimately, this game was one that was perhaps the most intriguing to analyze from this week and the most unexpected to analyze from this regard. But coming up next, we're going to be transitioning into the world of college basketball. A first-time segment here in the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, looking at all the top contenders at the midway point of the season and how they could look come March Madness. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about that as well.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for the first time here on the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, we'll be talking about a new sport, college basketball. The season is heating up. We're getting ever closer to March Madness, the excitement that brings. And I just wanted to talk about a couple top contenders and where they kind of fit in the whole scheme of March Madness in terms of whether or not I believe they're true championship Final Four contenders or are on the precipice of potentially breaking through or could be on the outside looking in but still could make some deep tournament runs. Now, this college basketball season has been one that I've been paying a little bit more attention to, but I'm not necessarily certain that I'll be able to give you that much intel on all these teams. I have seen a couple of these teams play, and I do feel like I kind of can gauge where they could be come March Madness. But this is all just hypotheticals. Remember, this March Madness tournament is a crapshoot, and we never know what's going to happen. So any one of these teams could win, or someone entirely different could. But seeing as to how, for the first months of the season, we're finally starting to gain a better sense of all these teams, I thought this was appropriate to kind of rank them in terms of tiers to see how they pan out come March Madness. So without further ado, let's jump right into them, starting off with Tier 1. These are the teams that I believe are highly capable of not just making it to the Final Four, but also being able to win the national championship. Now, all of these teams kind of have one specific trait that I feel they're going to be able to lean on come March that I truly believe separates them from the rest of the pack. And it's a group of 5 teams that I've seen kind of in equal amounts, and I feel like I know that they can do it. It's just a question of how they do it. But ultimately, these Tier 1 teams I truly believe in, and it starts with Houston, a team that clearly has proven over the past 5 years they are true championship March Madness contenders through their physical brand of defense. Kelvin Sampson really loves preaching winning through defense, and he finally has a well-built team with 2 guys in the front court in Javier Francis, J.Juan Roberts, who truly buy into that sentiment. They're fantastic two-way players as well. They have a lot of balance, this team as well. LJ Cryer, an experienced point guard, leading them in terms of his production on the offensive end, and ultimately being a team that I feel has a chip on its shoulder. Because over the past couple of years, you felt that they finally got everything right. They had a point guard in Jamal Shed who was really one of the best point guards in college basketball throughout most of his career. They ultimately came up short last year in that legendary game that went to overtime. I believe it was against Texas A&M. And ultimately just had a couple of frustrating years. But this could potentially be the year. And other teams that could follow suit in this group, Iowa State. For the first time, I saw them Saturday on the road in a tough environment against Texas Tech in a Big 12 game. You know how high stakes those can be. And they really impressed me in being able to come back in those couple final moments and take it in overtime and ultimately win that game in overtime. They're not just as like Houston, an aggressive defensive team. They have offensive pieces. I love Joshua Jefferson in the front court, Curtis Jones in the backcourt, leading this team on the inside and outside. They're very, very versatile. They're very, very fast. They can beat you in transition and on the fast break. And then in terms of Kentucky, if you want a team with a more layered attack, this team is for you. I like every single one of these players. Andrew Carr, I loved him. I watched him against Duke, one of the most underrated players in the country. With the balance they have in both the backcourt with Jackson Robinson, a very experienced player in Big 12 environments, now in the SEC. Was the Big 12 Sixth Man of the Year last year for BYU. Really impressive young man. And also just the fact that they're really buying in to Mark Pope's culture as well, as he is the new head coach there in Kentucky. And then Duke, a team that everyone is hyped about because of their freshman phenom, Cooper Flagg. But it's not just Cooper Flagg, let me tell you. It's Con Kneppel. It's Kamon Malwalk. It's all of these young guys. And then it's the veterans in Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster who really add to this team. Really gives them the perimeter threat, really makes it easy for these freshmen to insert themselves into the team. So overall, these four teams, highly scary. Houston and Iowa State defensively, Kentucky and Duke for more layered attacks. But any one of these teams could potentially win the championship come March. But in terms of Tier 2 teams, this is where it gets kind of interesting and a little bit more messy. These are teams that I feel are at the very least Elite 8 contenders, could push into the Final Four, could even win the national championship, but they still are that tier below these four elite teams, in my opinion. They are the Kansas Wildcats, a very deep and experienced team, but it all comes down to health and perimeter shooting, and I feel like they have that, but they really need to put it all together in big games. They have the ability. They have the big man up front in Hunter Dickinson. They have fascinating players in the backcourt like DeJuan Harris, very underrated point guard. But I think most of it's going to come from the production up front. Not just Hunter Dickinson, but impressive, I believe, second-year man Floyd Badunga. I really like him as well. But ultimately, this Kansas team really could shock a lot of people. They were the preseason AP #1 team. They kind of had a couple of pratfalls along the way, but they are a team highly capable of amping it up come March Madness. Then UCLA, kind of a surprise team this year in the Big Ten. Top offense, but only when Dylan Andrews is in. He's dealing with injuries. He's their top point guard, one of their top players. They just had a bizarre loss to Rutgers. My dad was pretty happy about that, though, as a Rutgers alum. But ultimately, UCLA is one of those teams that just needs to catch fire. They don't have the Johnny Juzangs and Jaime Hawkins of the world anymore. And Mick Cronin has been growing a little bit frustrated with how this team has been playing over the past couple of weeks. So they're highly capable offensively, but they need Dylan Andrews to be that point general for them consistently. And then a team like UConn, a team I'm all too familiar with as a Xavier fan over there in the Big East. I think that this is an iteration of this team that has its flaws. Alex Caravan potentially not playing as well as people thought he was, being the leader of this team. And the front court potentially not playing up to par. I do think that Hassan Diarra is one of the more underrated big men in the country. He just needs to play like it. And then the addition of a top recruit in Liam McNeely, that transition potentially not as hopeful as it seemed. And then Aiden Mahaney, the St. Mary's transfer, presumably coming in to fix the perimeter shooting. He certainly can at certain points of the season, but ultimately not coalescing as people think. They need better defense for all of these fantastic Big East offenses and beyond. But I do think that this UConn team kind of goes under the radar a little bit. But ultimately, in terms of overall outlook, they certainly are a team that can spring a surprise. And then I would throw in, say, a team like Auburn. I think that they're a very talented team. It very well could be the number one team in the country. But that Johnny Broom injury, let's see how significant that is. And can these transfers in Chad Baker-Mazara and Denver Jones continue playing at a high level and consistently for this Auburn team? And then Tennessee have a couple of fantastic players. I think that I have always appreciated Tennessee as one of the more high-profile SEC teams, but this year just feels a little bit different than other years. They don't have someone like Connect to touch the floor. I do like Sakai Ziegler as more of a floor general, kind of a Tiger Campbell-like player, if you remember him from UCLA. But it's going to come down to, can they continue beating the elite teams they need to succeed come March Madness? Are they going to be battle-tested enough? So those two teams I would put in Tier 2 as well. But ultimately, these are the teams that are on the precipice of being potential Final Four contenders, in my opinion. But they're not quite there yet. But I do consider all of them highly, and they just need a couple things to go right for them. And then, last but not least, we have Tier 3 here. And Tier 3 is a group of teams who I haven't necessarily seen that much this year, but I know that a lot of people come March Madness time are going to love them in terms of their brackets. I know a lot of these people or pundits could potentially see them as the dark horse candidates to make deep runs in the tournament, and I can ultimately see a way and path that they can. I really like this Oregon team, one of the deepest teams in the country, and Texas Tech. Speaking of teams who are going to be battle-tested in the Big 12, already very battle-tested. Tough loss at home against an Iowa State team that ultimately has been very tough to beat, but proven that they can go toe-to-toe with those kinds of teams. The youngest Toppin brother leading them, JT. I love his explosiveness on both sides of the court, and I really think that ultimately, this Texas Tech team can't be underestimated just because they play in a loaded conference and might fall by the wayside in terms of seeding and go under the radar in a lot of people's brackets come March. And last but not least, let's talk about the Purdue Boilermakers, a team that has lost its luster ever since Zach Edey left, but still have the players, some players from last year's Final Four run and ultimately championship game run, where they finished runners-up. But ultimately, I do think this Purdue team can concentrate on other aspects of what makes them stellar outside of just feeding Zach Edey like last year. They have Braden Smith and Fletcher Loyer, both players who can lead the team in terms of, for Smith being their kind of point general, leading them on the offensive side of the floor. Fletcher Loyer, kind of the three-point specialist for them. Trey Kaufman-Renn, a kind of Swiss Army knife, can play multiple positions. Cameron Heide obviously going to have to step up in the front court as well as Caleb First, a player who's been around a lot in this roster but hasn't been getting that much playing time because of Zach Edey's presence for the past couple of years. He's going to have to step up, but ultimately I do like the leadership of this Purdue team. But ultimately, these three teams in Tier 3 are teams that I think you have to watch out for in March Madness. Maybe they're not the teams that will ultimately contend for a national title, but I do think that they could break a couple brackets if things go their way. But ultimately, looking at this tier, I like all of these teams here. I've watched them in terms of varying degrees. I kind of know a little bit more about, say, Duke or Kentucky than I do about, say, Kansas or UCLA. But ultimately, I think that all of these teams, for the reasons I have explained and put forth, can ultimately challenge for the national championship. Let me know what you think if you're a college basketball fan and you know a little bit more about these teams, or might want to even throw one of your own teams into the ring as well as a potential contender. But coming up next, we preview another fascinating basketball game taking place out in the Western Conference between the Houston Rockets, the stunningly red-hot Rockets, and the Denver Nuggets, a bizarre team in the Western Conference, so to speak. We'll be right back after this short break to talk about it.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of today's show, we'll be previewing another excitingly thrilling basketball game taking place in the Western Conference tonight between the Red Hot Rockets of Houston and the Denver Nuggets, a team who have been quite bizarre to say the least to analyze if you're a podcaster like me, but ultimately should still be a thrilling affair in the Western Conference. Both of these teams fighting for playoff positioning. Both of these teams seemingly contenders for that Western Conference championship spot. But ultimately, one more surprisingly so, and one not necessarily surprisingly so, but disappointingly so in how players around Nikola Jokic have played. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as the segment goes on, but I do want to address how the Rockets have begun to relish games like this as a surprise contender out west. 26-12, sit just behind the Oklahoma City Thunder in the Western Conference standings, and have really proven that on both ends of the floor, they're one of the most balanced teams and one of the most well-coached teams. Kudos to former Celtics coach Ime Udoka. I always love throwing love to former Celtics coaches and players for building a culture in which every single player can thrive over there in Houston. And going up against the Nuggets tonight, this is a game they're going to have to continue to relish. Now they are a true contender for a championship. And so they can't take this game lightly, and I think that every single one of their players loves playing a team like the Nuggets. Alperen Şengün is practically chomping at the bit as an undersized big man trying to go toe-to-toe with Nikola Jokic. So I can tell you this Rockets team is motivated. And then if you're the Denver Nuggets, you have started gaining momentum. You have some nice wins. Last night's game against the Mavs, a big one in terms of getting secondary weapons going, like Jamal Murray, who had a season-high 42 last night. But that's going to have to be something that happens on a consistent basis. And this is a Rockets team that's well-rested, highly motivated to play someone like you, and you're going to have to go out there again if you're, say, Jamal Murray, Michael Porter Jr., Aaron Gordon, or Christian Brown, and really try and step up your game to help aid Nikola Jokic's MVP caliber play, almost averaging a triple-double with no support. And so that's an interesting development there. But let's talk about the reason why this matchup became fascinating. And it's the Rockets' meteoric rise in every single statistical category that matters, especially on the defensive side of things. And that's what I want to pinpoint here. They're third in defensive rating, points allowed, and three-pointers allowed. So they really take a lot away from you on the defensive side of the floor. In terms of offense, they're led by dauntless players such as Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, and a veteran point guard in Fred VanVleet, who don't really care what you think of them. Jalen Green is becoming one of the best stars in the league in terms of driving to the rim with relentlessness and aggression and passion. Alperen Şengün, on both ends of the glass, one of the most important rebounders for his team in the entire NBA. And he plays with heart defensively no matter who he's going up against. And going up against a guy who he's definitely not going to have the size advantage against, look for him to try and create opportunities for steals defensively to get the Rockets out in transition and ultimately score fast break points, which is something that they really relish doing against teams like the Denver Nuggets. And the Nuggets side of things, I don't really have many notes for them right now in terms of overall play, but they are a team that I feel can evolve outside of the Jokic-centric ideologies we all think they have. It's just going to stem down to guys like Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. stretching the floor, making it difficult for certain players to key in on Jokic defensively, because that's what they need. And Jokic, again, still averaging triple-double like numbers, having an MVP caliber season, most likely going to win his 4th straight, but in order for it to mean something, in order for Denver to challenge for championships, all of his stats need to be important to the overall outlook of the team. He can't just be putting up stats to put up stats. And you need to come up with results. And you've been getting results a little bit over these past couple of weeks, but you're going to have to do it against tougher teams, and the Rockets are one of them. And the Rockets don't owe anything to anybody. They're playing well within themselves and the culture of their team, and they're basically playing with house money in all of these Western Conference games. So if you're the Denver Nuggets and you don't have the rest that the Rockets have over these past couple of days, you're going to have to prove that you're the more experienced team through your secondary players, because that's always, in my opinion, been the consistent problem with the Denver Nuggets. They haven't necessarily showed up for Nikola Jokic in games of this magnitude, even though it's in the regular season. And that's what's off-putting about analyzing the Denver Nuggets. The Houston Rockets are such a great team to analyze, on the other hand, because they're easy to analyze. They're doing every single thing well. And I think that in terms of the outlook of the league, their team primed for the next couple of years, them and the Thunder, to duke it out in the Western Conference. This game could potentially be a dud. And a lot of you might be skeptical about why I'm analyzing it, because it might not even be important for the outlook of this season. But for the Rockets, I guarantee you, every single win is a benchmark for them, because it's proven that they have staying power in this very crowded Western Conference. And not a lot of teams can hold bragging rights like that. The Denver Nuggets included, because look at where the Denver Nuggets are now. They're in a loaded Western Conference where teams quickly rose around them, and they're kind of stuck in this purgatory where, yes, they had the one championship where Jokic went beast mode in the postseason, led them to a very hard-earned championship trophy. But now, all these young teams, the Rockets, the Thunder, the Grizzlies, are developing all these players around you. And if you're the Denver Nuggets and you have the same core that you've had for the past decade or so, really, you have to figure out a way to prove to these other teams that you still have a say in the reckoning. And I don't necessarily know if the Denver Nuggets buy into that a lot in the regular season. I feel like they're starting to become a team that wants to focus more on what happens in the postseason because it matters more. But if you allow these teams to get motivated with wins over you, chances are the regular season won't matter anymore, because you're slowly falling down the Western Conference standings. So if I'm the Nuggets, I have to find ways to continue to push the envelope with Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. and really get them prepared for this Western Conference renaissance. Because I do feel there's merit in what the Denver Nuggets are doing, keeping a lot of their core. Yes, a lot of their core has not been healthy, and that's a big reason as to why over the past couple of years they haven't really capitalized on their success. But this feels like a year where anything can happen in the West. And in order for you to pounce, almost every single player on your team has to be playing in rhythm. And I can't say that about the Nuggets. I can say that about Houston. I can say that about OKC. I can start to say that about teams like Memphis, and potentially say the Dallas Mavericks when everyone is healthy. But right now, who's to say that this Denver Nuggets team will be motivated for a game like this if all of their stars aren't buying in? And I feel like, yes, we look at this game as at face value, as a regular season game, and we view things like rest and who played last night for Denver and who didn't. Then potentially I can say, yes, this is an evenly matched game, and I think the Denver Nuggets will be ready for it. And if Jamal Murray is the only player last night who played more than, say, 30 minutes, then this overall Denver Nuggets roster should look good. But I'm viewing this game as someone who believes in this Houston Rockets team, not just in the regular season for games like this, but in postseason games, in games of a bigger magnitude, because they're starting to play like a team that is motivated. They have a coach who clearly has developed an identity of fast-paced offense, aggressive defense, and they're really buying into it. I love each and every single one of these players in terms of the specific traits that make them special and really help make their team special. And as a result, it's adding up to wins. And now they're a team I can say aren't sneaking up on anyone anymore. And this is a game that, yes, at face value, like I said, probably won't mean much, whether it be in the standings or for the futures of these teams. But looking at how the Rockets have improved and looking at how the Nuggets have stayed in this kind of purgatory state, this could be a momentum shift in terms of how people view teams like the Rockets, Thunders, and Grizzlies trying to knock the Nuggets off of their perch, because it's starting to become reality very quickly. Let me know what you think about this game in the comments. Should be a thrilling one either way, no matter what I say. And I might not even watch this game, but hey, this is going to be a good one in the Western Conference. But coming up next, a little bit of change of plan, improvisational segment. I'm going to be previewing a game involving Arsenal, but not the one that I thought was taking place this weekend. I'll be back to explain after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for my final segment of the day, I have some explaining to do. I was going to preview the North London Derby taking place today, but I underestimated the time of it. It started at 3, kind of in the middle of my show, so I could have said, throw caution to the wind and let me preview the game for all my Spurs fans, but I'm sorry to all you Spurs fans who are anticipating this. I'm sorry for misleading you in my short, but I do have to preview another big Premier League game taking place this weekend involving Arsenal, but against a team in Aston Villa who I feel like also have a lot of questions surrounding them at this point. But I can tell you, if you are willing to follow my segment but want updates on the North London Derby, that at the half, after 25th minute Son Heung-min goal, for the break, Dominic Solanke own goal and a Leandro Trossard strike has put Arsenal 2-1 up at the break there. But ultimately, previewing this game, this should be a good one. I'm glad that I got to switch it up a little bit because this is a tactical masterclass here with two managers with very similar approaches, with two similar teams who have proven that they're willing to take progressive approaches in terms of their respective rebuilds for their teams. With Mikel Arteta over the past few years at Arsenal, and for Unai Emery, someone who has proven that with every team he has gone to, he gets results, both domestically and in the cup competitions. But ultimately, this game should be exciting, and also something of note, Aston Villa playing as well with a 1-0 lead off of a Ollie Watkins goal against Everton in the 73rd minute. So, as you can see, both of these teams staying and maintaining in good form. But let's talk about ultimately how these two teams will match up, because this is a very interesting game. Because Arsenal, if they hold up here against Spurs in the North London derby today, they will have 4 wins on the bounce in the Premier League, but they did have a bizarre FA Cup encounter with Man United this midweek. Last week, I believe. No, they did play this week, didn't they? I got them mixed up because of all the fixtures taking place. And then Aston Villa, if there's any team more baffling in the Premier League or in any international league thus far, it has been Aston Villa, because while they have proven in the Champions League, they've taken points on my Bayern Munich, winning that game. Unai Emery showing his prowess in both fronts. They have had some baffling results that see them sit 8th in the Premier League. That might just be down to all these surprise teams such as Bournemouth, Fulham, Forest taking their places amongst the top 6. But ultimately, Aston Villa still a team that could give Arsenal a fight in the Premier League this weekend. But in terms of the last result, we have to go all the way back to, I believe, match week 2, with a 2-0 result going in Arsenal's favor, with Leandro Trossard and Partey being the goal scorers there. But in terms of how this game could play out and what it would mean for both teams, I really think that it's going to come down to which manager is going to be a little bit more ambitious. And in terms of the transfer window, which we're in right now, it seems like Villa's making a lot of ambitious moves. And while I do like Daniel Mullins, a player coming over from Borussia Dortmund and who could be able to play in this weekend's game, I don't necessarily think he fills an area of need. I think Villa is very loaded in terms of their winger and attacking depth. But ultimately, if they feel like Daniel Mullins can add an interesting aspect of dynamism to their front lines, then by all means, this could be a good signing for them. But I still think that with John Duran, Ollie Watkins, Morgan Rogers having a great start to his season, all of those players, not just in the wing, but up front, I do think this Daniel Mullins signing is a bit puzzling, and I don't know how he'll fit in to the squad if he should play on Saturday. But let's go over to Arsenal here, because this team feels like they're still going to be in title contention, and if they win today, they would move above Forest into second and 4 points behind league leaders Liverpool. So it just goes to show that you have to stay consistent to even maintain a pace with your fellow title contenders. And Arsenal has proven in the past couple of seasons they can keep that pace to a certain point, but have come kind of falling down. But this is a different race because it's a little bit more open than last year. You can say as many as 4 to 5 teams are going to be competing for this title in the stretch should Liverpool or, say, Forest slip up in their title challenges. And Arsenal could be ready to pounce. And they certainly have the good form right now to do it. But then there are performances, and yes, it doesn't necessarily matter because it's a cup competition, like the FA Cup game in the third round against United, where I feel like Arteta invested too much in that one just to beat a rival and move on in the FA Cup rather than focus on the task at hand and really challenging Liverpool in the title race. And so while it's paying dividends right now at the half against Spurs, you have to wonder why Mikel Arteta tinkers a little too much with this team, because that's the only thing I see holding back Arsenal in this title challenge. It is Mikel Arteta, a Pep Guardiola protege, mind you, going to overthink a little too much a la Pep Guardiola. And so that's why I bring up the FA Cup third round tie, because you had players who are in your starting roster for much of your Premier League games. William Saliba, Kai Havertz some of the time, and Gabriel Jesus, I believe, played in this game as well. So people who you really rely upon in your title challenge, and you play them and they play horrendously. And I know that it doesn't necessarily translate to Premier League success, the FA Cup, but it does translate in terms of who you play. Because, yes, Arsenal have proven they can be a deep team, but ultimately, when these players have bad performances, you start to wonder why they even played at all in these situations. And so, looking at this lineup here, just looking at it because I don't even know who these teams played, you have the same players in certain positions. Havertz up top. You did decide to bench a couple players, say in terms of your left back, Lewis Skelly playing today. Rice, Partey, and Odegaard, though, remain in your midfield. And your front three, you're not their strongest front three, obviously, because I believe Saka's still out with that injury. But still, Havertz haven't played in that midweek game as well. And so, you have to start to wonder, if you're Arsenal, do you, in certain competitions, risk going out there to invest in winning the Premier League this year? Or if you're Arteta, just say, I'm going to play my best players no matter when, no matter what competition it is, and say, you have to deal with it if you're the pundits, because that feels like that's his plan. And I know I'm going to have to address Villa at some point, but Arsenal, the ball is in their court with all of these games, not just this Villa game. The ball is in their court in terms of how they determine their Premier League fate. And I would say, if I'm an Arsenal fan, yeah, you're still in the Champions League. Yeah, it's a nicer trophy to have in your cabinet, but the Premier League is one that you really have coveted these past couple of years, haven't won since your invincible season. So you're really going to have to walk that fine line if you're Mikel Arteta and his squad, for that matter, in terms of deciding whether or not you're investing into one thing or going all out on all fronts, because that's what he showed against Man United in midweek. And then if you're Aston Villa, I don't necessarily think you're panicking right now in the league. If you look at the league table, things can go your way. It's just that all of these teams are overperforming. And I've seen a lot of Villa games for some reason this season, even though I'm not a Villa fan. And I see a team under Unai Emery that really, on any given day, can perform like one of the best in not just England, but the world. They've proven it as Champions League participants this season as well, taking results off top teams across different nations. And so, if you're Aston Villa, I would say you take this Arsenal game seriously, but if you're Unai Emery, you really tinker with your depth as well. Because I feel like the Premier League table will not look like this in the upcoming months, because I see the Bournemouths and Fulham slipping up and not maintaining their consistency. And that will fall into your hands if you're Aston Villa. But then again, I think that Aston Villa are a sneaky dark horse contender in the Champions League as well. I think a lot of England's teams are going to perform well in the Champions League this year. And so, if you're Unai Emery, that's the thing. This has happened before in your career with a lot of clubs just like Villa, who haven't smelled European success in quite some time. But this is the first time with Villa that you're performing on both fronts. And so, if you're Emery, much like Mikel Arteta, who has had to do it, I think, over a little bit longer time with the roster he kind of has right now, if you're Emery, you're now starting to build a template for what this Aston Villa team can do in the future because of what you've already done to this point. I think Villa are a little bit farther along their rebuild than Arsenal were when they hired Mikel Arteta, and it's starting to bear fruit with how they're performing on both fronts. So if you're Aston Villa, even if you lose this game, you shouldn't necessarily worry. You should worry, though, if you don't perform well in it, because you do want to maintain your solid form and good performances. But I wouldn't panic if I were Aston Villa. Whereas for Arsenal, you're now calling yourself serious title challengers, and you have to prove it week in, week out. And you have been proving it in the Premier League, but decisions you make in other competitions could lead to your downfall as well, and they have to keep that in the back of their minds as they make their title challenge in the Premier League. So it should be a good game over the weekend. Sorry to all my Spurs fans. Again, I thought I was going to be able to do this preview, but ultimately I misjudged the timing of it. But ultimately, this Arsenal-Villa game could also be a good one. So if you're an Arsenal-Villa fan, let me know in the comments what you think about this game. But that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back here same time as always tomorrow. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show if you haven't done so already and you want to keep up to date with all our content. But other than that, I am out for today.